of history to introduce the speaker.
Respected Principal, Dr. P. Wilson, learned guest of honor, and my teacher, Dr. Professor Aditya Mukherjee, who is a professor of contemporary history, Jawaharlal University, Abasa, Mr. Cyrus Kallupurakal, deans, officials of the college, heads of the departments, professors, my teachers and former heads and former professors, guests from various colleges, alumni, friends, and my dear students, a very good morning to all of you. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the 4th Dr. Chandran Devanesen Endowment Lecture today. To begin with, let me introduce and say a few words about the Dr. Chandran Devanesen Endowment Lecture. The endowment was instituted in 2017 to mark the centenary year of Dr. Chandran D.S. Devanesen, who distinguished himself as the professor and head of the Department of History and the first Indian principal of the college. He later went on to become the founder vice chancellor of the Northeastern Hill University in Shillong. Many institutions, former students, and his family contributed handsomely to keep alive his inspiring memory through an annual endowment lecture. At this juncture, I would like to make a special mention of Dr. Mrs. Vasanthi Vijaykumar, former head of the department, whose untiring efforts led to the institution of the endowment. When we decided to hold the lecture this year, which had to be organized online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my first thought was to have Professor Aditya Mukherjee as a resource person, who unhesitatingly accepted to deliver this lecture. I deemed this as a great privilege to introduce him, as he's also my teacher. Professor Aditya Mukherjee was still recently the professor of contemporary history, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. An erudite scholar, a brilliant academician, and a captivating teacher, he has held several prestigious positions. At various stages of his career, he had been the chairperson of the Center for Historical Studies, the dean of the School of Social Sciences, director, Jawaharlal Nehru Institute of Advanced Studies, JNU, executive council member of the Indian History Congress, president of the Indian History Congress on the session on modern India, appointed member of the Board of Trusteeship of the Indian Board Equity Foundation by the Government of India, to name only a few. He was a visiting professor at the Duke University, USA, and La Sapienza, University of Rome, Italy, and was awarded the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science Fellowship and a one-year Japan Foundation Fellowship by the University of Tokyo. He was also a visiting fellow to the Institute of Advanced Study, Lancaster University, UK, Institute of Advanced Study, Nantes, France, and the Institute of Advanced Study, Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is in the editorial and advisory board of several reputed journals, such as the Studies in History, published by the SAGE, Rajiv Gandhi University Research Journal, and the International Review of Sociology, published from Rome. He is author of several well-known books and articles, numbering nearly 100. His works are his best introduction. Who has not read his work along with Bipin Chandra and fellow colleagues on India's struggle for independence, India after independence, 1947 to 2000, imperialism, nationalism, and the making of the Indian capitalist class, communalism of education, the history textbook controversy, history in the new NCERT textbooks, to name only a few. And his, as I said earlier, his publications go on for pages. But I'm sure his book, these books are the best introduction to Sir. However, I would like to share a few thoughts as a student. A few memorable assertions and quotes remain with me forever from his classes. The Indian capitalist class grew in spite of and in opposition to colonialism and colonial policies. The difference between pre-capitalist mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, and the colonial mode of production were compared to drive home how distinct the colonial economic structure was from the others. The elucidation of surplus extraction through the diagram that he drew for the triangular trade, or the famous quote, "The circuit of commodity circulation is completed via the metropolis," forever ring in my ears. His demonstration to show the difference between a shift and a swing, I still remember it very, very fondly in the classrooms. Sir, it is really a great privilege for me to have you here to deliver this lecture. Dr. Chandran Devanesen's achievements in the field of education were driven by a vision that reflected the ideals of excellence, equity, inclusiveness, community participation, democratizing student governance, and participating decision making. It is a vision that reflected in many ways the vision of the Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. It is only befitting that a lecture on Jawaharlal Nehru and nation building in India is delivered by Professor Aditya Mukherjee, whose own institution building capacity and zeal as the Director of Academic Staff College JNU and the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute for Advanced Studies, I had a glimpse of. With these words, I welcome one and all for the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I welcome our principal, Dr. P. Wilson, to share the remarks.
Good morning, everyone. The chief guest for today, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Professor of Contemporary History, Center for Historical Studies, JNU, Head of the Department, Dr. Venkatram, and faculty members and students of the Department of History. It's a joy that this particular title is ascribed to Dr. Chandran Devanesen's Endowment. It's a befitting tribute that we could make to Dr. Chandran Devanesen, who was a multifaceted personality, being a teacher, being a historian, maybe as a researcher or a lay theologian or a poet or playwright, whatever you say, his name is there. Such a versatile personality. Was a leader of Madras Christian College. Then he moved as a founder, vice chancellor of Nehru. I'm thankful to the department for having considered this topic as a nation building. Let me share one or few thoughts to initiate the discussion and call it a day. If you look at the history of education, pre-colonial and post-colonial, carefully if you analyze, you can see that education was considered as intellectual enjoyment in the beginning. And later, after Nehru's period, it was used for industrial development. Now we are into the dispensation of knowledge economy, where education is being used. Now, this is a kind of an evolution. There are different perceptions that people can have to see whether education can move towards this direction or not. Can we define that as a development? This is an argument that can endlessly go on. But if you carefully analyze this economic development of India, the new education policies that are periodically revised and refined, if you carefully look into this particular aspect, the educational governance framework that is being periodically revised, people are looking forward for redefining education in terms of vocationalization. That plays a vital role in the new education policy that we are now entering into. The question comes, if you say education is redefined partially as vocationalization, developing only the a skilled workforce, then what about developing leaders? It's a big question that we are still arguing with. My question is again, Will the development of skilled workforce develop the whole country's economy? Or only developing the economy of the country will define nation building? These are the questions that I've been pondering over. Now we are all into digitization of Indian education system now. I do not know the fate of digitization. We are all reaping the consequences of this pandemic lockdown and the status of education. How are we going to redeem it appropriately for complementing with the existing education system is a question that we all should think of when it comes to the context of nation building. India stands 62nd rank when it comes to the total public expenditure on education per student. 62nd rank, maybe 3% of the GDP is being spent on education. I would say that when it comes to the nation building, we need to have a very comprehensive picture, not a polarized one, only looking into the economy, only looking at the business, and then redefining the education. We need leaders. If you look into the 21st century skills that people talk about, we need people who can think creatively, critically, communicate with their team members, and collaborate. These are the 4 skills that have been identified as very significant skills that students ought to learn before they leave the institution, rather than dumping them with knowledge. Knowledge is accessible everywhere, but how to think, what to think, they'll do it. But how to think is a question that is laying on the responsibility. It is on all of us that we have the responsibility to mold the students on thinking process. So I'm sure that if we can create some thinkers, whether right or wrong, let them discern it properly. If we can create some thinkers as a part of our education, I'm sure that nation building will be the consequence. So I congratulate the Department of History on this occasion for having thoughtfully arranged this particular endowment lecture and inviting a reputed person from Jawala University, the former professor of Jawala University. And I'm sure the discussion that you're going to have, it's not only a lecture, but I'm sure that it'll be followed by discussions from student side as well as by the faculty side. And this discussion would really make you to think. Definitely can debate, nothing wrong in debating. And I'm sure that it will evolve a kind of a thinking pattern among students and faculty members. So I wish you all the best, and I thank the professors for having accepted our invitation on behalf of Madras Christian College and being a part of this endowment lecture. Thank you, sir, and thank you, Department of History.
Thank you, sir, for the inspiring words. I now welcome Professor Aditya Mukherjee to deliver the endowment lecture on Jawaharlal Nehru and the nation building in India.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to the principal, Dr. P. Wilson, for his extremely meaningful comments. I'll have quite a bit to say on many of the points that he has raised. After all, Nehru emerges as a leader, essentially as a member of the intelligentsia. And Dr. Wilson's comments are really talking about what constitutes an intelligentsia. It's not only a knowledge worker, but somebody who can participate in nation building, in creating society, is really genuinely a true member of the intelligentsia. And I'll have much to say about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for this opportunity. I'm also very thankful to my friend and brilliant former student, Dr. Venkata Ramanujam, who now heads the Department of History. I'm so proud of that, for this opportunity to address colleagues, students, and friends of the very prestigious Madras Christian College, where I've had the opportunity some years ago of lecturing once. I'm very grateful that I'm able to once again interact with you. I'm particularly thankful for the opportunity to deliver the endowment lecture in the name of Professor Chandran Devanesen, as was mentioned, the first Indian principal of the Madras Christian College. He was a great institution builder and an intellectual. As students of history, when I first began to study his history, his important book had just come out in 1969, The Making of the Mahatma, which had just got published, and it was We all read it. And this book focused on how South Africa was the preparatory ground for the emergence of the Mahatma, of Gandhiji. My talk today relates to the great legacy that Dr. Devanesen had outlined in his book. I shall talk about Jawaharlal Nehru, a person Mahatma Gandhi had handpicked as his successor, a person who constantly debated and argued with Gandhiji. If you read his autobiography is a continuous criticism and argument with Mahatma Gandhi. And yet, he was the greatest promoter and builder of the values enshrined in the Mahatma. As Gandhiji said so presciently, when I am gone, he said, Nehru, Jawahar will speak my language. Gandhiji's immense faith in Nehru and his understanding of his personality is reflected in a famous speech he gave at the All India Congress Committee, AICC, on 25th January 1942. I will seek your indulgence for a brief quotation from that speech to set the stage for the discussion that we are going to have today. Gandhiji says, somebody suggested that Pandit Jawaharlal and I were estranged. This is baseless. Jawahar has been resisting me ever since he fell into my net. But he says, with typical Gandhiji's great ability to use idioms which resonate with the Indian people, he said, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It makes a lot of sense in today's world, where you will find that the attempt to divide our national movement is so common, especially in the social media. Division between Nehru and Patel, division between Gandhi and Nehru, division between Bose and Nehru and Gandhi, division between Bhagat Singh and Gandhi. You're all the time seeing attempts to divide the national movement. And what Gandhiji says is, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is just as difficult to divide us. I've always said that not Rajaji, not Sardar Vallabhbhai, but Jawaharlal will be my successor. When I am gone, he will do what I am doing now. Then he will speak my language too. Then Gandhiji goes on to say, he learned something new. Because Nehru as an intellectual is constantly experimenting, learning, growing. But he says, ultimately, he will have to speak my language. And then he ends by saying, even if this does not happen, I would at least die with this faith. Now look at this conviction that he had about Nehru's capacities and his character, that he would rather die with the faith that Nehru will carry his legacy forward. Now, why did Gandhiji have such tremendous faith in Jawaharlal Nehru? This was for two reasons. First, because Jawaharlal Nehru quintessentially represented and fought for the values of our freedom struggle, the values of our national liberation movement, which Rabindranath Tagore so beautifully summed up in 3 words: the idea of India. This term idea of India was coined by Rabindranath Tagore. This is the first reason why Gandhiji thought so highly of Nehru, because he represented the idea of India and he fought for it. Second, because Gandhiji saw in Jawaharlal Nehru the most capable person in leading the effort to implement the idea of India once the newly born Indian state emerges after independence. That is, Nehru was to perform the task or lead in performing the task of nation building in India. And this nation building was to occur within the parameters of the idea of India. That is, within the parameters of the values set up by the national liberation struggle. My talk today is therefore on Jawaharlal Nehru and his brilliant effort at nation building in India. But first, let me outline what is this idea of India, especially for my younger friends. What is this idea that Nehru tried to implement after independence? The idea of India was a vision, as I said, the vision of the national movement. It is not the vision of any one individual or any one current of the national movement. This was a consensual vision. This was the vision of the entire spectrum of the national movement, from the moderates to the extremists, to the Gandhians, to the socialists, to the communists, to the revolutionaries. All of them, except the communalists and the loyalists, who were not part of the national liberation struggle, the entire spectrum that I have mentioned from the right to the left agreed to this basic idea of India. Now, what are these basic elements of the idea of India? Let me just outline quickly, and then we will see how Nehru implements them after independence. The most important and the first idea of element. Before I go into these elements, I must say that these values of the national movement went deep down into the minds of the Indian people. It went deep down into the minds of the Indian people because the Indian national movement was a mass movement and a prolonged mass movement. Nearly 100 years of mass movement, that is interacting with the masses, involving them in the movement, took these ideas very deep down. I'm contrasting with a revolution, where professional revolutionaries or a Red Army or guerrillas, seize power and lead to a change of state. It is not that. It is a change of state on the basis of a prolonged mass movement. Therefore, these ideas are very important. They go deep down. Now, what are these ideas? The most important idea, of course, is sovereignty and anti-imperialism. That the future India will be independent. It will not be a junior partner to any superpower that emerges, nor will it become an imperialist power by itself. It will have no grand design of becoming a superpower itself. It will be anti-imperialist in its content. The second basic idea, and extremely important, was democracy. The future India would be a democratic state. From as early as the 1890s, Bal Gangadhar Tilak is talking of adult franchise, that the constitution we are looking at, if the free India that we are looking at is going to be one which is going to have adult franchise in which each citizen, irrespective of his caste, irrespective of his class, irrespective of his religion, gender, color, language, it doesn't matter. He will be a citizen of the republic. He will be equal citizen. So this notion of democracy is there from the very beginning and cuts across from the right to the left for everybody. And it's worth emphasizing this. Do realize that as late as the 1960s in the United States, which is often seen as this great model, they were still fighting for the civil rights for the blacks. They were still fighting whether a black person can sit next to you, leave alone vote. Most of the world had not yet given, till the Second World War, the right to women to have equal access to the vote. So that they had to have major movements for enfranchisement of women. And here in the 1890s itself, in the vision of our Indian nationalists, they're already saying that we want adult franchise. The third element, which is critically linked with the second, is that India, the future India, would be a secular, inclusive. The secularism in India did not mean removed from religion. You can be deeply religious and yet be secular. It was a completely different meaning in the Indian context from the French one. Here it meant inclusive. And you could not be democratic if you were not secular. That is, if everybody was not treated equally, then how can you be democratic? So therefore, these two concepts went hand in hand. Secular democracy was the term used for decades and still is still used as coterminous. When you talk of democracy, you talk of secular democracy. You cannot have a democracy in which only some people are going to have democratic rights, others are going to be junior partners or subservient citizens. That is not democracy, that is fascism of some kind. All right. So this was very important, democracy and secular democracy. The counterpart is at that time was communal loyalists. Just as communalism and loyalism went hand in hand, all communal parties were loyalist. Similarly, nationalism, democracy, and secularism went hand in hand. The fourth and very important aspect of the idea of India, which is increasingly forgotten, people think of anti-imperialism, fighting democracy, etc., but they forget this element, was that in the idea of India, it was as as your college song that was read out in the very beginning, which talked of love and unity. You can see this unity is already there in the notion of secularism, and this the issue of love. That is, you're going to be not a dominant, aggrandizing state, but one which is ethical, which is sensitive to the people. A pro-poor orientation existed in the idea of India from the beginning till the end. To just explain this a little more, from the moderates onwards, people like Dadabhai Naoroji, what is his first book? Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. You read R.C. Dutt, you read Dadabhai Naoroji, you read Rana Day, you read Surendranath Banerjee. I'm mentioning all the 19th century intellectuals, the members of the intelligentsia which created the Indian national movement. All of them start with poverty. They say that we want the overthrow of British rule because it causes poverty to our people. All right. So from then on to, of course, Gandhiji, who takes it further, puts the face of the poor turns the face of the Indian people towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, as he called. He sees God in the poor. And then, of course, the socialists and the communists, they play their role in turning the movement towards the poor. So this was a very important aspect of the idea of India. Now we have to see whether all of these remain and to what extent we succeed in meeting this vision and to what extent we do not. But before I do that, I want to present to you the contrast and the uniqueness of this idea of India. This imagination, as you have read, those of you who are students of history, that nations and nationalism are imagined. They don't exist from time immemorial. 50,000 years ago, there were no nations. There were empires, there were kingdoms, but the nation or nation states, as we understand them now, are a modern phenomenon. And different countries imagine their nation in a different way. Whether religion, language, political situation, climate, geography, all of them went into the formation of a nation in different mixes. All nations are not the same, as is obvious. Now, what was the imagination of the Indian nation? I said it was unique.
I said it was unique. How about a web search for it?
I think somebody interrupted. The reason why I'm saying that this was a unique imagination was because it was in sharp contrast to the manner in which nation states emerged in the modern world at that time, in the 18th and 19th centuries. Nation states, as you know, emerged in Europe largely as homogeneous units, one language, one religion. Catholic France, not even The unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, out of the breakdown of the earlier empires, occurs on the basis of one language. France was a multilingual country, and the French Revolution sort of flattened it out into one language country. In this situation, where these were the critical elements in the formation of nation, India imagines a nation where it will celebrate diversity. The more the languages, the more the religions, the better it is. The British said, how can India be a nation? When the national movement began in India, they said, you cannot be a nation. Because they said, you are only a geographical expression, just a boundaries from this latitude to that longitude. Because you have so many religions, so many languages, etc., 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 far more than the whole of Europe put together. This diversity cannot be a nation. But our nationalists imagined a nation where this diversity itself will be the important component of our nation. And that was the uniqueness. The whole world today now looks at this unique definition. The European Union have sent delegations to India to study that how is it that India, which is much more diverse than Europe, succeeded in making itself into a nation, whereas Europe, as you are aware, is finding it so difficult to even keep the union together, leave alone, they are not still a one nation, but even to agree on a common currency and certain common principles, they're finding it so difficult. So it was a unique imagination in the 19th century. The second thing, and very important element that you must remember, is the Indian imagination of the nation was very different from the European imagination of the nation in two other respects. The European nation states emerged with the rise of capitalism in Europe. And along with the rise of capitalism, colonialism emerged. As each nation state emerged in Europe, they also acquired colonies. Each one of them, France, England, Spain, Portugal, just name it. United States later, Japan. As they emerged as modern nation states, capitalist modern nation states, they also acquired colonies. In other words, in the formation of their nation and national identity, there was an aggrandizing or dominating element. Whereas the Indian nationalist imagination was anti-imperialist, it was liberating. It was not dominating. It is important to remember this distinction between the two, these two distinctions, that while the European understanding was homogeneous units, ours was diverse, celebrating diversity, where the European imagination was aggrandizing, dominating, ours was liberating. It is important to remember this because it is the Indian vision of nationalism, not the alien vision, the European vision, which, if it was not unchecked by democratic movements in the various European states, it ended up with the Hitlers and the Mussolinis. The logical conclusion of this aggrandizing, homogeneous, one identity-based nationalism was the kind of fascism you saw in Italy and Germany. It didn't happen in other countries because there were counter-democratic movements there. So it is this alien notion of nationalism which one is to be critical. And one must realize that this is not our nationalism. That's why it's important to study history and to understand when we speak nationalism, everybody is throwing around nationalism these days. But let us understand, what nationalism are we talking about? Are we talking about this European variety? Are we talking of this fascist variety, or are we talking about this great innovation of the Indian people from all over India, which occurred from the 19th century? Okay. It is this unique vision which was to be implemented in independent India. And Jawaharlal Nehru was among the tallest leaders at that time who was to implement it. As you know, shortly, within months of independence, Gandhiji was assassinated. Sardar Patel dies in 1950. So a lot of the burden of implementing the idea of India does fall. He's not single-handed. There are great stalwarts in the national movement, from Rajaji to Rajendra Prasad, and there is no dearth of great leaders of that time. But undoubtedly, a lot of that burden fell on Jawaharlal Nehru. The first challenge to the idea of India came at the point of the birth of the nation itself. Look at the period 1946 to 50. 1946, you had the great Calcutta killings, where the Muslim League organized massive killings. The direct action day, the direct action call given by Jinnah led to massive killings in Calcutta of Hindus. Then there was the killings in Noakhali, again in 1946, again organized by the Muslim communal forces against Hindus. As a reaction to that, you had massive killings in Bihar, now of Muslims. On a large scale, for the first time, the rioting spread to the rural areas and large-scale killings occurred. While this communal frenzy and rioting was at its peak, you had independence, which came with the partition of India. 5 lakh people died in the process of the partition. Something like a minimum of 60 lakh people were rendered homeless, pushed out of their homes and had to migrate to another country. One of the world's largest migrations in such a short time occurred during the partition of the country. This is what we now call a Holocaust-like situation. The frenzy, the emotional frenzy that had emerged in at the point of independence was almost like the Holocaust when the Nazi killings occurred of the Jews. It's a tremendous situation. In this situation, the nationalist leadership, led by Gandhi, stood like a rock. Gandhiji was, as you know, famously called by Mountbatten as a one-man boundary force. He single-handedly prevented, for example, any killings at independence in Calcutta. He went there at the invitation of Suravardi. And he said, yes, I will come, but you walk with me the streets, and not a single killing occurred. Where 1 year earlier, the massive killings had occurred. That is when Mountbatten called him the one-man boundary force. And as you know, Gandhiji paid with his life for his insistence that there would be secular unity between various religious people following various religions. Nehru too rose to his full stature in this period. To resist this challenge, he also put his life at stake. Some historians have called this his finest hour, the Nehru's finest hour. While Gandhiji, what was Gandhiji doing at this time? One must remind our young colleagues and friends that when the transfer of power is occurring, and mind you, the transfer of power in India is a major global event, because that's what sets into motion the process of decolonization all over the world. The first major country to become independent in this manner was India after the Second World War, right? So it's a major event happening after a 100-year-old struggle. And the leader of that movement is nowhere to be found when the transfer of power is occurring. Where was he? He was in the remote villages in a corner of Bengal called Noakhali, where rioting was occurring and many, many people were being killed. So Gandhiji was there at that time, and he was walking from one village to another. He would not sleep in the same village every night. He would walk from one to the other. And when communal people who were offensive to his idea of unity threw glass and human refuse on the path that he was to walk, his answer was to take off his slippers and walk barefoot. I mean, the notion of the crucifixion of the flesh. He was punishing himself. He was saying that, what India have I created? He says, what is the point of freedom if the soul of India was destroyed? So for Gandhiji, the soul of India was Hindu-Muslim unity, was religious fraternity, every citizen being equal. He says, what use is it if we don't have that? Nehru too plays his part. So Gandhiji is there, and mind you, how long was he there? This is important especially for people to remember today. The leaders went to Gandhiji and said, Gandhiji, this is a very important time. Transfer of power is happening, negotiation, etc. We need you. How long will you be there? He said, I will be there as long as it takes. And do you know how long he stayed in the villages of Noakhali in this period, 46 to 47, from November for 4 months. From November to March 1947, Gandhiji was touring the villages of Noakhali. On the other side, Nehru as president, as the prime minister, the interim prime minister of the interim government in 1946, he took on hand the riots in Bihar. He landed up in Bihar, again it will surprise you, with his entire cabinet, Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, Maulana Azad, Jayaprakash Narayan, Acharya Kriplani, all of them he took with him, and he landed in Bihar, and he said, we will not move from here until the riots are quelled. And they stayed there, used everything and every instrument at their command to ensure that communal riots ended in Bihar in a short time. He said in November 1946 in Bihar, I will stand in the way of Hindu-Muslim riots. Members of both communities will have to tread over my dead body before they can strike at each other. This is the kind of spirit with which he went he took on this first challenge, as I said, to the idea of India. He declared in 19th August 1947, 4 days after independence, our state is not a communal state, but it is a democratic state in which every citizen has equal rights, and the government is determined to protect these rights. Nehru saw Gandhiji's assassination in this general atmosphere of communal frenzy, not as an act of one mad man, some mad individual, but as an effort of an organization to change the very nature of the newly born state. He said that this communal frenzy is being utilized in order to try and create a counterpart of Muslim Pakistan by creating a quote-unquote Hindu India. That is, the nature of the Indian state will not be, again, no more secular, but it will be the counterpart of Muslim Pakistan. He says that was the effort. It was the word he uses in a letter he writes to the chief ministers in 5th February 1948. It is a deliberate coup d'etat was planned involving the killings of several persons and the promotion of a general disorder to enable this organization to seize power. So here was, at the birth of the state, an effort to seize power away from the idea of India into a different notion of nationalism. It was this threat that Nehru was not going to, he took on full frontally, and he was not going to allow it to succeed. And the best way to do it was to go into the people. And Nehru did so by doing the following, a very interesting thing. He converted the first general election in 1950-51 into a virtual referendum on a single question: what was to be the nature of the Indian state? Are we going to be a secular, democratic state? Or are we going to be a mirror image of Pakistan? Are we going to be a Hindu majoritarian state, or are we going to be a secular democratic state? And on this, he traveled the country incessantly. He traveled about 40,000 kilometers, and no aircrafts, etc. those days. He traveled by, there are descriptions of the modes of travel that he had to use, from walking to elephants to jeeps to trucks to whatever, to bullock carts. And he addressed about 35 million people, which means he addressed about 1 out of 10 people at that time of the country. as I'm talking to you directly, he was talking to 1 out of 10 people. And the results were dramatic. I mean, again, it is not only Nehru. Since I'm talking about Nehru, I'm giving his example. But I'm saying that those who carried the legacy of the national movement worked in the first election to save the essential idea of India that was at threat. And the results were dramatic. In a peaceful, and they're dramatic because you must remember, this is just 3 years after the partition. 3 years from a Holocaust-like situation, we had a peaceful, fair election. The whole world saw it and declared it as a peaceful, fair election within, as I said, 2 years of a Holocaust situation, where the communal parties all put together, the Hindu Mahasabha, Jan Sangh, Ram Rajya Parishad, Muslim League, etc., all put together could win only 10 out of 489 seats. They got only 6% of the votes. So 94% of the Indian people voted with their feet in favor of India being a secular country. It's a great achievement. And it was possible only because, as I said, the vision of the national movement spread deep into the minds of the Indian people over 100 years. The Indian people were not going to accept an alternate vision. It was a stunning achievement, a tribute to the legacy of our national movement. The first election, the results of that pushed back communalism for decades. Gandhiji's assassination was a very important element. Even people who were veering a little towards communalism suddenly shrunk back and said, oh my God, this is the result of it. That the greatest Hindu, as Gandhiji was called, gets murdered. So they pulled back from it. His assassination and the combined effort of the nationalist leadership pushed communalism away from the developmental path in India for decades in the beginning. But unfortunately, it was not extinguished. It was only pushed back. Now let me turn to other aspects of the idea of India. The first, the most important, as I said, was the question of sovereignty, independence. Jawaharlal Nehru was very clear. He was, as you know, an extremely highly educated person, an intellectual, a really 19th century intellectual with a very wide range of reading and understanding. He understood that political independence was not enough without economic independence. Economic and intellectual independence were equal components of independence. If you just get political independence and you remain dependent economically and otherwise on the countries from whom you become independent, all that you have done is shifted from colonialism to neocolonialism, which is what had happened to large parts of the world. Latin America is a very good example, where you shifted from, you got formal independence, but not real independence. What does that mean? In 1950, when India became independent and your first plan is to be done, you became independent in 47, but in the initial years, to grow, you had to make investments. No country can grow unless they make investments. But to invest, you need machines. But India produced no machines. 90 to 95% of the machinery required to make any investment had to be imported. From whom? From precisely the country and countries whose domination created the imperial domination. India could not even make machine tools. 95% of machine tools, your pliers and wrenches. Ask your grandparents, they'll tell you the pliers and wrenches were Gedor, imported. We didn't make our own. Nothing. So Nehru decided that this independence is not going to be real. We have to do something else. And what does he do? He brings in what is now famously called the Nehru Mahalanobis strategy of capital goods, heavy machinery-based industrialization. I'll give you just one couple of brief statistics to make my point. From 1950 to 65, the Nehruvian years, he dies in 64, industry grew in India at 7.1% per annum. In this period, there was a threefold increase in industry in India, But this threefold increase was explained by a 70% increase in consumer good industries, a quadrupling of intermediate good industries, that is goods like heavy chemicals, steel, etc., and a 10 times increase in capital good industries. So it was a very interesting, what you are witnessing in these 15 years is a structural transformation of the Indian economy. In 1950, you are totally dependent on the very countries from whom you became independent. And by the 1970s, now listen to these statistics, Nehruvian strategy reverses this. In 1950, as I said, more than 90% of machinery had to be imported to make any investment. By 1960, it was only 43%. That is nearly 60% you could do on your own machines, because by now the public sector industries, the capital good industries, the Hindustan Machine Tools, the Bharat Heavy Electricals, etc., Bharat Earth Movers, etc., have come up. By 1970s, it had come down to 9%. That is, you got your true sovereignty. 91% of your growth you could manage on your own capital good industries. This is one of Nehru's greatest contributions, which people forget today, that you could not have done what you are doing today if you had not created the base which was created in the Nehruvian times. It is this which enabled India to become truly sovereign. It is this which enabled India to have an independent foreign policy. It is this which enabled India to lead the non-aligned movement, lead 100 countries away from either of the two superpowers. And both the superpowers hated the idea that here are these small countries not falling into our tutelage. But how could India lead this if they themselves were not independent of either or all? And that is why one must, one of the greatest contributions that Nehru makes towards this goal of sovereignty is his economic strategy. This unstructuring of colonialism that happens in the early years, in the Nehruvian years, is what enables India to open up later, as we saw in the 1990s. These are not the wasted years. The Nehruvian years are not the wasted years. Young people who now have grown up have said, look, wow, what lovely growth we had since 1991. If only we did not have the Nehruvian period, we would have reached very high. Now that is completely ahistorical. That is rubbish. You could not do, if you had opened up like you did in 1991, if India opened up in 1950, like we opened up in 1991, India would have been a banana republic. You know what a banana republic is? Banana republic, there is no such place called a banana republic. It's an imagination of this American short story writer called O. Henry. But the imagination is of these countries which are totally subservient, one product producing subservient countries to the advanced world. India would have become that if you opened up in 1950. You needed these 40 years of unstructuring colonialism so that you could later open up with advantage to yourself and not as junior partners. This is important because a lot of neo-colonial scholars, people like Lord Meghnad Desai, Professor Tirthankar Roy, etc., describe the Nehruvian years as the first 40 years being wasted. These 40 years are not wasted. All colonial countries which made a transition to growth later on needed these 30, 40 years of protection, of 30, 40 years of economic nationalism before they could open up. Even China opened up only in 1978, nearly 30 years after independence. So China needed its Mao, India needed its Nehru, Egypt needed its Nasser, Indonesia needed its Sukarno. All right. So one must see this historically. Another lie, if I may call it so, which is often spread in the social media, is about Nehru ignoring agriculture. He's supposed to have focused only on industry, and that too heavy industry, and he ignored agriculture. Now, this is again ahistorical. I wish that is why I also moved from economics into the study of history, so that we don't live in a fictitious world, of models and graphs, reality. Now, did Nehru ignore agriculture? It is under Nehru. Within the first 2 decades, the land reforms occur in India. It ends nearly at a 200-year-old, the zamindari system. And that too within a democratic framework. One of the biggest institutional reforms with the democratic framework, again unique in the world. No General MacArthur's army doing the land reforms like in Japan and South Korea. No forced land reforms, no forced collectivization. But the land reforms do occur. Agriculture grows in the first 3 plans at about 3% per annum, which was 8 times faster than the growth that Indian agriculture saw in the previous 50 years. It is a revolutionary breakthrough. To say that Nehru ignored agriculture would be wrong. Even to suggest that the Green Revolution strategy had to wait till Lal Bahadur Shastri came to power is again a misconception. It is while Nehru was still alive that the Green Revolution strategy of intensive agricultural district program was started. And in any case, the Green Revolution strategy presupposed that you had your institutional reforms. Land reform had already occurred. It also presupposed that you had a certain amount of industrial growth. That is, you could produce your tractors, you could produce your fertilizers, you had your dams and electricity, you had the power, you could make your diesel pumps, etc. Now, that is what Nehru did. So it is a complete misconception to say that he ignored agriculture. I will only end this by quoting one of the finest economic historians who studied India at that time, Daniel Thorner. You've all heard of his name. Daniel Thorner and Wolf Ladejinsky. Wolf Ladejinsky was one of the world's greatest sort of planners of land reform. You know, he did it for Japan, he did it for Korea and a whole bunch of other countries. And he also advised India. So Daniel Thorner says, I'm just quoting one line. He says, it is sometimes said that the initial 5-year plans neglected agriculture. This charge, he says, cannot be taken seriously. The facts are that in India's first 21 years of independence, more has been done to foster change in agriculture, and more change has actually taken place than in the preceding 200 years. So he is very clear that in the first 15 years, you saw more change than that you saw in the preceding 20 years. And as I said, the important thing to remember is that this transition in industry and in agriculture occurs in India with democracy. And as Nehru very consciously said, that we have done this we have adopted a path which is uncharted in history. The transition to industrialization globally did not occur with democracy. It occurred on the basis of slavery. It occurred on the basis of enclosure movements, that is forcibly pushing out the peasantry. It occurs on the basis of forced land tax, like in Japan, 50% land tax. It occurred on the basis of forced collectivization. It occurred on the basis of colonial surplus appropriation. Now, none of these options were open to India, to democratic India. That is, the idea of India had ensured that whatever path we choose has to be one which is democratic, does not use force, is pro-poor. And this path, and that is what was one of his greatest contributions. That is, we were able to raise the surplus for investment, not on the backs of our working class peasantry and other colonial people of other colonial countries. We found alternate ways of doing it, and that was Nehru's success. A quick reference here to another aspect of sovereignty of which Nehru was very, very clear, and Dr. Wilson has made a reference to it. If you read the first plan and Nehru's intervention from 1950s onwards, he gives as much importance to the development of education, higher education, not just to make clerks and, commerce graduates, but science and technology, an area which was left barren under colonialism consciously. He focuses on that. All your IITs IIMs, your National Physical Laboratory, National Chemical Laboratory, Bhabha Atomic Research Center, just name the institution. They are conceived of in the Nehruvian period. So immediately, what he does, in other words, is he anticipates the knowledge revolution. As Dr. Wilson has correctly said, we have moved towards a knowledge society, and Nehru anticipates the knowledge revolution. Without this breakthrough in this sector, India could not have maintained its sovereignty, that we would become dependent on the Nehru, other parts of the world. And it is this which has enabled India today to participate in the information revolution that is occurring in the world. If we had not created that base, it is not despite Nehru, but it is because of Nehru that we are able now to participate. Do remember that the dynamic sector of the Indian economy, the leading sector of the Indian economy, is no longer agriculture or industry. It is the services sector. And what is the services sector but not information and knowledge? And that has become possible only because from the 50s itself, an emphasis was put in that. Towards the end of my talk, I'll have more to say on this aspect. But this is not to say that Nehru ignored primary education. Again, another jibe or lie, if you like, that is spread about Nehru. That Nehru did higher education, but he ignored. This is not true. From the 1931 Karachi resolution, read it. The Karachi resolution says that the Indian state is committed to free and compulsory primary education, basic education. If again talk to your parents and grandparents, where did they go? They went to government schools. The decline of the public school and college system and its replacement with a rapacious private sector, not like MCC, that is not, I don't have MCC in mind, but you know what I'm talking about. There are universities in India today for where to pay to get a BA degree, ordinary BA, you have to pay 15 lakhs a year for 1 year. That is, you need 45 lakhs, So there are such private universities that exist right next to the capital in India. Now, this has occurred in recent times. The destruction of the public education system, the destruction of the public health system, which was started in the Nehruvian period, is something that has happened after Nehru. The blame for that cannot be put on his shoulders. Just to give you one statistic, though, on how much emphasis was put on education. Dr. Wilson mentioned what a ridiculous proportion of our GDP we spend on education compared to most other countries, compared to many third world countries also. Our contribution to education is very low, and it is decreasing, not increasing. In Nehru's time, the expenditure on science and technology increased from rupees 10 million in 1949 to 4.5 billion by the mid-70s. It's a phenomenal growth. So by the mid-70s, India had already become the third largest manpower in scientific and technically trained personnel in the world. As I said, I will come back to this in a moment. Turning back to the other aspect of the idea of India, the pro-poor aspect. Nehru's success in keeping India on the democratic, civil, libertarian path against considerable odds. Do remember that almost most of the countries which became independent after, could not maintain democracies after their independence. India was quite exceptional among the third world countries which built and retained a democratic system for decades after independence against the prediction of a large number of people in the world. Now, his insistence of keeping the democratic civil libertarian path, that is free press and democracy, was one of the biggest guarantees for the poor. Now, this has been theorized by Professor Amartya Sen brilliantly. He says democracy is not to be treated just as one political thing. He says it is integral to the economic well-being of the poor. And he gives the example. He says democracy and civil liberties is what protects the poor. He says in China, and he contrasts China with India, and he says in China, something like 20 to 60 million people died of famine when they did their cultural revolution and experiments with communes, etc., etc. And look at this, 20 to 60. Why am I saying 20 to 60? Because the world doesn't know, because there was no free press. Nobody knows. But the guess is that between 20 to 60 million people died. He says in a democracy, it is not possible. In India, with 70,000 newspapers, 700 satellite channels, no large-scale famine deaths can occur. One death in Kalahandi in Odisha, and it is all over the newspapers. That is why no famines occur. So civil liberties, a free press is very, very critical and for protecting the interests of the poor. That is, democracy is one major element, but this is not enough. And Nehru was deeply conscious of it. While political democracy was understood by Nehru to be a necessary condition for people's empowerment, he was clear that it was not sufficient condition. As he put it in 1952, I'm quoting him, if poverty and low standards continue, then democracy for all its fine institutions and ideals ceases to be a liberating force. It must therefore aim continuously at the eradication of poverty. In other words, political democracy is not enough. I'm quoting Nehru. It must develop into economic democracy also. And that is what he tries to do during his tenure. The creation of development programs, the creation of the village workers, the integrated plans of village workers, and later attempts of creating the Panchayati Raj institutions, that is empowering the people at the grassroots. Unfortunately, it took decades after Nehru for them to get legislated in the 73rd and 74th Amendment. But Nehru had pointed in that direction consciously in the very early years of his political presence. Jawaharlal Nehru, as you know, was deeply influenced in the 1920s by Marxism. His contribution in embedding and then making widely acceptable the socialist ideal of empowering the poor is probably unparalleled. The word socialism did not, became of common parlance all over the country. And he was able to do that because he was one of the first in the world. And I want to emphasize this, again, something that is not known about. He was among the first in the world, as in fact my teacher had pointed out, Professor Bipin Chandra. He was one of the first in the world to break out of an orthodox, oppressive kind of Marxism, which he termed as Stalin Marxism. He was one of the first in the late 1930s. He broke out of that notion of Marxism. And the only other person who did it, who's much more known in the world, colonial people, their breakthroughs are never recognized, was Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci makes the same breakthroughs as Nehru in the 1930s and breaks away from this Stalin Marxist position. That is, they're looking away from an insurrectionary, violent, Bolshevik model of transformation. And Nehru now says in the late 1930s, one of the first in the world who says, he insists that civil liberty and democracy had to be basic elements of socialism. He says there is no democracy without socialism. And by socialism, he's just meaning pro-poor. As I clarified, he's not meaning a communist regime, an oppressive communist regime. He's giving that up. He's saying there can be no true democracy without socialism. There cannot be no socialism without democracy. So this was his breakthrough. And this breakthrough enabled the overwhelming majority of the Indian people in the 30s and 40s to accept the idea of a pro-poor, loosely defined socialist ideal. If you look at the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, from playwrights to film stars, from Raj Kapoor to musicians like Ravi Shankar, dancers like Uday Shankar, all of them, the poets like Faiz and Kaifi Azmi, and just name it, all of them were imbued with the socialist ideal. And as I said, not narrowly defined, but defined in the same manner as Gandhiji defined it, as putting the face of the poorest man in front of you before you took a decision on what to do next. Lastly, a few words on Nehru's critical role in the building and nurturing of the institutional functioning of democracy. He, do understand that, we were ruled for 200 years at the point of transition to modernity. So from the pre-modern world, we are pushed into the colonial world, which, as Venkat remembers very fondly, we have insisted is not modernization, it is not capitalism, it's a distinct structure. And from there we come out and we have to now create the institutions of democracy. So Nehru puts enormous weight to the parliament. He attended every session, listened to the opposition, all their speeches, and responded. I mean, if you look at the collected words of Nehru, you will see how seriously he attended parliament, how much, despite his overshadowing presence, how much importance he gave to the cabinet system. There are autobiographies written by many of the cabinet ministers of that time, like C.D. Deshmukh, where he said that Nehru would insist that take your own decision. Don't keep asking me. You are the finance minister. So, it was a very different world, which is worth and his insistence, and this is important, his insistence on a free press and a vibrant opposition. He was not talking of an opposition mukt India. He says there is no democracy if there isn't a vibrant opposition. Let me quote you a few sentences from Nehru. He says, "This is too large a country with too many diversities to permit any one so-called strong man to trample over their lives." It's not going to be a one-man-led country. That is, it has to be a country with lots of opposition. I do not want India to be a country in which millions of people say yes to one man. I want a strong opposition. And when Nehru found that he was such a popular leader, there was not enough opposition to himself. This is now well known. He, in a pseudonym, using the name Chanakya, wrote articles criticizing himself when he found that there wasn't enough opposition coming from outside. And while criticizing himself, he says that India should not countenance any tendency towards the emergence of a quote-unquote dictator or any strong man. He's referring to himself. Any strong man emerging, using his popularity and using the language and slogans of democracy and socialism, which he used. He talked about democracy and socialism. So he's criticizing himself, that India should not countenance any tendency towards the emergence of such a person as a dictator. We all know fascism has fattened on this language. That is, the people must be discerning and not allow this to happen. Very prescient. He was, one must keep this in mind. I will like to end, because I think I've taken a lot of time, with quickly three aspects which are important today in keeping in mind the legacy of Nehru and the attempt at nation building. The first, we must remember that the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is not that it leaves behind a devastated economy. As Tagore had said, that when the British go, they'll leave behind mud and filth. Of course, they left behind mud and filth. But that is not the longest lasting legacy. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism is wherever it has gone, it has left behind a divided people. The first colony in the world, Ireland, is still divided on the basis of Protestants and Catholics. India, as you can see, one of our major problems today is division on a religious basis. Look at Africa, look at the Middle East. It is tribes. Wherever the colonial powers have gone, the people are divided on basis of religion, ethnicity, language, tribe, whatever division works wherever. So this is something that one must remember, that the undoing of political and economic impact of colonialism has happened in many parts of the world, like in India. But the undoing of the division that was promoted and created by imperialism still needs to be done. It is not a leftover of the past. You must remember that Islam came to India while the Prophet was alive. So did Christianity come to India almost immediately after its origin. And the Indian people found organic ways of living together over centuries. As an example to the rest of the world. Colonialism comes and freezes these identities, makes them into political identities conflictual with each other. And we have not been able to get out of it. So that's point number one. And we must learn from the national movement and Nehruvian effort to challenge this identity-based politics towards a secular, democratic, modern based politics. Second thing is, Nehru's name is associated, again, as Dr. Wilson said, with the promotion of what he called a scientific temper. In the discovery of India, he coins this term scientific temper, a scientific bent of mind. You don't have to be a scientist to have a scientific temper. Venkat and I are not scientists, but we try to apply science or a scientific thinking to the discipline of history, right? And as you can say, much progress was made in the Nehruvian period from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s towards moving towards a more scientific, progressive world outlook. But here again, we are beginning to regress. We are allowing space to obscurantism, to mythology, to blind faith, to unscientific claims. Claims like in ancient India, we knew plastic surgery. Otherwise, how did Ganesha have a elephant head? We knew nuclear science. Otherwise, how did Arjuna have a nuclear tipped arrow? He's supposed to have a nuclear tipped arrow, or we knew all about flying. Otherwise, how did the Pushpak Viman come, etc., etc. What I'm trying to say is that mythology, which exists in all societies, is treated as mythology. And now we are suddenly finding people converting that mythology into reality and saying that this science existed in ancient India. So this is the second big challenge, the return to the scientific temper. The third challenge is the colonization of our minds. This is very important. As I said, the political and economic challenge we have met quite successfully. But the colonization of the mind is very important because it inadvertently leads us to participating in the colonization of our own country without even realizing it. If you will permit, I'll just take 3 minutes on this. What do we mean by colonialism? Having taught for 40 to 45 years, I found that we have a very frozen concept of what is colonialism. Export of raw materials and import of manufactured goods. But that is not what colonialism is. For the first 50 years of British rule, we didn't export raw materials. We exported manufactured goods. Colonialism, in one sentence, is the taking away by the colonizing power of whatever happens to be at a point of time the critical factor of production. In the pre-industrial world, the critical factor of production, what made you rich, was land. But land is of no use without labor. So in the pre-industrial world, in the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, what was colonialism? Colonialism was grabbing other people's land and calling it discovery. Entire continents were grabbed, like the American continents. or like India. And they were called discovery. The very word is Eurocentric. They discovered. How can you discover a 5,000-year-old civilization? It's already there, you know. But for you, it's a discovery. And it has become now the word that India was discovered and, you know, America was discovered, etc., etc. So you saw grabbing of land and labor. With industrialization, the critical factor of production became capital. So what you saw in the 19th century, the time that industrialization really takes off, is taking away of resources from the colonies as capital to finance industrialization in the advanced countries. What Dadabhai Naoroji and others called the drain of wealth. 85% of the investment that Britain made to become the first industrialized country in the world was financed by what it took as tribute from the colonies. Okay? What is the critical factor of production today? Go back to Dr. Wilson said. What is the critical factor of production? We are a post-industrial society. The critical factor of production is knowledge. And what are we doing today? Nehru, with enormous effort, based on the sweat and blood of the poor of India, created a huge resource pool of knowledge. By the mid-1960s, we had engineers and doctors coming out of several institutions. But almost all of them sat an exam to migrate to the West. The cream. For more than half a century, India has lost the cream of its intelligentsia in the critical area of science and technology to the advanced countries. Now, let me give you a statistic, not my own, but a statistic produced by the American agency called US National Science Foundation. It found that 95% of Indians who go to the USA to do a PhD in critical areas of science, from mathematics to nuclear physics or medicine, 95% stay there. They don't come back. Then it says that in the 1960s, before the migration from India began, only 17% of American PhDs were by non-Americans. By 2012, 40%. That is 2 out of 5 American PhDs in critical areas, which is what makes America the first country in the world, were done by non-Americans. And Asians, India and China, were major contributors to this. So what is happening? While the advanced world just rakes it in, we hand it out. And while handing it out, we pat ourselves in the back and say, wow, what a great thing we have done. This is not slavery anymore. This is not forced migration. This is not immigration of the coolies. This is not what was called the indentured labor. This is the Indian elite vying with each other, fighting with each other to voluntarily migrate. And while doing so, while objectively performing the task of, as Tilak said, decorating another's wife or watering somebody else's garden, or in more scientific language, of transfer of the critical factor of production of knowledge from one society to another. While performing that task, we think we are doing a very great job. I tell this story many times. I've said this in Chennai also in another occasion, of my interaction with an IIT professor who once met me, and while chatting, he said, Professor Mukherjee, I'm delighted today. And I thought his student must have made some great invention or breakthrough or some discovery. I said, why are you so happy? He said, Professor Mukherjee, my whole class has gone to the United States. That is when I realized that how sick our society has become. We are a product of our intelligentsia of the 19th century. We did 3,000 hours of interviews all over the country, starting from northern Kerala, went down to Cape Comorin, came up Tamil Nadu to Odisha, Bengal, etc. 3,000 in the rural areas. We talked to poor people and asked, What is it that brought you to the national movement? What is it that brought you to the working class movement or the peasant movement? 90% said our school teacher. That the teacher said that you must do something for your country. From that, we've come to a situation where the teacher feels proud if he has helped his entire class to migrate abroad. And I'm not blaming anybody. It is because you do not understand the role of the intelligentsia. That is why we need to go back to Nehru. Three things: save us united secular India, modern, scientific, progressive nation, and a genuine nationalism where the intelligentsia is committed to the development of its own people, even if it means financial sacrifice. The role of the intelligentsia, as distinct from anybody with a brain who makes money, is that he contributes to his own society in whichever way he can, small or big, rather than find a career. And that is something that we need to learn from people like Gandhi, Nehru, and our national movement leaders, who all gave up lucrative careers where they could have made a lot of money and spent years and years in prison, sacrificed their lives for what? For developing the idea of India, the dream of our national movement. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the amazing lecture, which is really the need of the time. I now request Dr. V. Chitra to moderate the discussions. Participants can post your questions on the chat box. I request everyone to, the questions can be posted in the chat box. Thank you.
So there is one, good morning everyone. So there is one question, why Nehru did not think to go back to organic farming instead of he went towards green revolution?
Do you want me to respond on the basis of what is in the chat box? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You see, I read a question why Nehru didn't think of going back to organic farming. Instead, he went towards green revolution. Very good question. It's a very good question. And I have a twofold answer to this. That is, you cannot blame somebody for something that did not exist in that period. That is, the knowledge of today cannot be assumed that Raja Ram Mohan Roy should have had it in the early 19th century. Organic farming as a method, the consciousness of environment really emerges from the 70s onwards in a big way. That is, it's a post-Nehruvian phenomenon, though Nehru was very deeply committed to the environment on the basis of what was the existing knowledge at that time. Secondly, the best of the people at that time, when the Green Revolution occurred, they did look at this question. For example, the greatest contributor to the Green Revolution is a person, as you know, who comes from Tamil Nadu himself, the great scientist. What was his name? Venkat, the name of the scientist who...
Professor M.S. Swaminathan.
M.S. Swaminathan, that's right. Thank you, Venkat. M.S. Swaminathan asked this question. And he said that if we did not have the Green Revolution strategy to feed the same number of people that India had at that time, we would have had to cut almost the entire forest cover that India had. So environmentally, by being able to produce in the existing land without extension of agriculture, by intensifying agriculture, you were actually saving forests. There is no doubt about that. The negative impact of the Green Revolution strategy, what happened to the soil, what happened to groundwater, etc., they began to emerge much later. And as they emerged, the scientists have now therefore moved to another level. They are trying to make other scientific breakthroughs. That is why biotechnology has become so important. That how do you feed a larger and a larger and a larger proportion of the world population without deforestation? And as for organic farming, that is undoubtedly the future. But it is not something that I totally agree with the person who's asked the question. The state needs to promote in a very big way in the future.
How can we reverse the colonization of mind?
Yeah. The first step towards reversing it is to recognize it. To seek, that's why what I tried to do at the end of my talk, to see what is colonialism, what is colonial about things that are happening around you. And then only you can begin to reverse it. If you don't see it, if you don't see, for example, that division on the basis of religion is a colonial idea, then how will you decolonize your mind? If you think it is a great nationalist idea, then you will not decolonize your mind. But if you read history, and if you see from the late 19th century, how consciously this division based on religion, caste, and other things was promoted by colonialism in order to defend itself. The raison d'etre of colonialism was no longer, in the early 19th century, the raison d'etre, that is the reasoning, the justification of colonialism was earlier that we shall develop you. We will modernize you. The white man's burden. We will civilize you backward, barbaric people. That was the ideology. That ideology was blown to pieces by our early nationalists. They showed that colonialism was not leading to growth and modernization. The argument, the justification for colonialism globally since the late 19th century became that if we leave, then you will fight amongst each other and kill each other. Therefore, we are there to protect the minorities. Now, if that is the justification, then you have to ensure that the various identities are not at peace with each other, that they must continue to be fighting at each other so that colonialism can continue. So there is an umbilical cord link between colonialism and identity-based division. We must recognize it and then begin to fight it. Similarly, as I said, in the intellectual realm, when you read a book written by Tirthankar Roy, for example, against which I had to write an entire presidential address, it's an Oxford economic history book printed by OUP, which is taught in universities and colleges. And what he argues in that book is something which I have said will make even Curzon blush. Lord Curzon, the most conservative viceroy, would have said, yes, we've done a lot of good things, but not as much as you say, Professor Roy. He says that there was rapid growth under colonialism, rapid growth in industry, commerce, etc. There was no deindustrialization, that we could not have progressed as much as we did if we were not colonized by Britain. And that is being taught and learned by our students. So you have to recognize that this is colonial and fight it. In other words, the question is extremely important. We have to do ideological work. Our colleges, our teachers from the schools, colleges, etc., our parents must play the function of bringing up a new generation which is not submerged in a dominating first world kind of ideology.
So there's one more question. Is there any chance to retain the intelligentsia committed to the nation instead of migrating to other countries?
There is. And in India, it is not going to be through force because we are a democracy. It is not that if you, like it was done in Russia and China, that if you went away, then we will take revenge on your families. You go, you have to come back. We don't want to do it like that. It can be done the way it is done in Japan, through a deep sense of nationalism. You go out. Japan had been sending its people to the West since the 19th century, since the Meiji Restoration of 1860s. Batches, large batches of Japanese would be sent to Europe, America, etc., to learn, etc. But they would all come back and contribute to Japan. Now we need to create an intelligentsia. Like, I'll give you, that is what my university was. I'm the first batch of my university. And the first thing that was taught to us by my teachers, people like Ramila Thapar and Bipin Chandra, etc., who gave up jobs and careers and great degrees abroad to come and settle down here. The founder of my department was Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan's son, Sarvapalli Gopal, S. Gopal, who comes from Chennai himself, who came from Chennai. He gave up a job in Oxford to come and set up a permanent job in Oxford to come and set up the History Center. And no one from my batch, not one person, migrated abroad. We didn't even think of it. It's not that we haven't traveled, as Venkat has told you. You travel, you learn, and you come back and you contribute. Now, this is what we have to create. We have to create universities where we create an intelligentsia which is committed to its own people, not universities which are a stepping stone to going abroad. Most of the universities that are coming up, the new private ones, money-making ones, are the first step towards going abroad. Now, instead of your CBSE exams, they have an exam called, I can't even pronounce it, it's called International Baccalaureate. More and more international schools are coming up where the students give this IB exam, so that immediately after school, they can free themselves from this horrible country and migrate abroad. Now you are creating, if your intelligentsia, if your educated people think like this, how can you make a great country? I once asked the chief of ISRO, the Space Research Organization, again a Tamil gentleman. I asked him, sir, how are you able to make such a great institution? When all our IIT engineers, etc., are all migrating abroad. He laughed on my face. He says, you think we have done all this on the basis of the elite institutions like IITs and St. Stephen's College? This country, he said, is made from the Mufassil towns, the small town intellectuals whose ambitions do not lie abroad, whose face is not turned towards the West. It is they who have made this country. And it is they who we have to empower. It is in them that I see the future. Among my students in my 45 years of career, the people who have contributed to the country have rarely been from the elite. They migrated and they become some small peg in the big machine in the West, not even noticed. Others who came often from Dalit backgrounds, from very poor backgrounds, from remote corners of the country, have made a contribution. And that is the future. That is our hope.
So the next question is why Nehru wanted to implement centralized administration rather than decentralization like US? We could have followed ratification method.
You see, it's a very good question. But you must understand, evaluate, as I said from the beginning, evaluate a person in the historical context in which he operates. British rule is trying to prevent a centralized formation of a nation state. They are saying you are not a nation. It creates hundreds of princely states. It creates divisions wherever it can. It even breaks up the partition of Bengal. It breaks up provinces in a manner that they are divided on the basis of religion and the basis of language, etc., etc., etc. Now, from that division, you are trying to create a unity. But Nehru is deeply conscious that this unity doesn't mean homogeneity. That is why the phrase that he uses continuously is unity in diversity. It is our phrase, which is now, if you Google South Africa, you will find the motto of the country in South Africa is unity and diversity. And I was so delighted that this is the contribution that our national movement has made. So surely these two processes had to go hand in hand. So while Nehru on the one hand is pushing for centralization because he doesn't want the country to break up, the vociferous tendencies when the nation is born is very strong. At that time, you have to create that unity. But simultaneously, as I said, he sees the necessity of empowering the lowest unit. That is why the power to the panchayats. That is diversity. So these two processes had to occur together, and it is an extremely complex task. How to keep the nation united on the one hand, and yet empower the regions, and within the regions, the sub-regions, down to the village.
I think it's the last question. From tarnishing the image of the makers of this modern India to rewriting facts of history, we are seeing attempts to rewrite the nationalist ideals in India and the nationalist movement itself. What should be the role of historians to stop this rewriting of facts? And how far is it possible in today's scenario for historians to stand by the facts?
Again, a very brilliant question. Why do you think I like talking to the people in MCC? Absolutely correct. What is to be our role? My teacher had once, my mentor was Professor Bipin Chandra. One, like Venkat has mantras in mind of what his teachers say. I have mantras in my mind of what my teachers taught me. And one of that was, he said, that you can never be a great social scientist or a historian if you lack courage. He said, courage more than intelligence is the first principle about being a historian. So what do we need to do? We need to be courageous and defend and bring out what is the true fact. Of course, lies are being spread. Every nationalist icon is being questioned. And it is not only from the right. This attack comes from the left also. Recently, Perry Anderson, who was the editor of the New Left Review, which is considered one of the major journals in the world for decades. He's a celebrity in the world. All of us read him. He's a wonderful academic, but knows nothing about India. And he wrote a whole book on India, which has been published, first published and as a serial in the London Review of Books, and then a left publisher in India brought it out as a book called The Indian Ideology, where he ridicules our national movement. He ridicules Gandhiji, he ridicules Nehru. He uses the same colonial terms to describe our national movement as Dufferin did, that the Indian National Congress represents a microscopic minority, that it is dominated by Brahmins and Baniyas and so on and so forth. So this is Eurocentrism. That is even Marxism doesn't inoculate you against colonial Eurocentric views. So Perry Anderson also adopted the same view. So we have to resist that. So every time, the sign of a live Nehruvian nation, that is why Nehru's mottos for universities, the sign of a live country is where people automatically resist, get up and say, this is wrong. So this is what we need to do. We need to do, as I said, all over, wherever we can. If nowhere else, at least in your family. If nowhere else, at least on your Facebook post. Say, look, I do not agree. I'm not part of this lie. Because lies have completely taken over. If you Googled Hindu or if you Googled India, you will find such an enormous amount of lies on the net that it is mind-boggling. So we have to contest it.
So there's one more question. As the young and future people of India, what are the steps we have to take to make India as a developed, united and powerful nation in terms of social freedom and well-being?
To repeat, again, very profound, very correct. To repeat, do what Gandhiji said, One of the reasons why he became such a popular leader was that he did not expect everybody to come 100 steps. That is, if you're not fully with me, then you're my enemy. This is the habit, particularly of many political formations, particularly of the left, that if you're not fully with me, then you're a revisionist, then you're this, then you're bourgeois, then I will not. Gandhiji said, if you come one step, if you take one step towards me or a good ideal, you are my ally. So don't wait for a revolution. Take that one step. As I said, that one step may be arguing with your parents who are promoting an obscurantist or an identity-based step, or your younger brother, or whatever. Take that first step in your classrooms, in your clubs, or in your playground, or wherever. Let us take the first step. The other steps will follow.
Thank you, sir. I think there are no more questions as of now, but I'm sure your lecture will stimulate, as they contemplate on what you have said, it will stimulate more questions and make them probe further on aspects you have mentioned.
And you shall answer those questions then, as my representative.
So the vote of thanks will be prompted by Dr. K. Ashok.
Good afternoon to one and all. I deemed it as a great privilege to propose the vote of thanks to the fourth edition of Dr. Chandran D.S. Devanesen Endowment Lecture. I profusely thank our guest of honor, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, for accepting our invitation and delivering the Endowment Lecture. Thank you, sir, for bringing us Nehru's contribution to national building, especially focusing on the areas of industry, industrial development, agricultural growth, science and technology, and rural development with the democratic civilian liberty path as the road to India's future. Sir, on behalf of the college and the department, I once again render my heartfelt thanks to you. I also thank our principal, Dr. P. Wilson, faculties, both former and present of our department and from other departments of MCC, faculties from city colleges and from other parts of the country, friends and well-wishers of our department for their virtual presence. I thank Dr. Ashik, Assistant Professor of Political Science, for his technical support. Thank you one and all for joining the lecture and hope you had a fruitful time of listening to this erudite talk. We look forward to your support in future too. Thank you one and all once again.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your gracious presence in today's event and making it a grand success.
Thank you. I had a great time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.